So now that we are somewhat familiar with the JavaScript language, we can start talking about function. And function are a useful tool to declare some code that we will need to reuse later in our code, of course. And we can declare a function by the function keyword followed by a name as if we were declaring a variable. Also, a variable, of course, needs a name. And we also need a couple of parentheses here. And we will see later in the video why these parentheses are useful. And of course, we need a block to define the code that will be executed when later in the code I will specify the name of the function followed by the, the parentheses. And when I have already declared the function and I rewrite her name followed by the parentheses, I am actually calling the function. So when there is no function keyword before the name and I have already defined that same function in the code somewhere else, then this what this piece of code does is replacing this part with whatever we define this function here. So we can now already understand why the function are so useful while coding, because I can really take the code I defined once and only one time in my code, of course, and replace it somewhere else in the code as many times I want without me to rewrite whatever I write here. And of course, here there could be a really large piece of code, so I don't have to rewrite it every time. Actually, there is not only one way to declare a function. This is the most common way, is of course by using the function keyword and the name of the function, parentheses, and some code. Also, function can be assigned to variables. And of course, to do that, we first need a variable, and I'll declare it here with the const because usually we don't want our function to be variable, therefore to change during the code execution. So I'm declaring here a variable using the const keyword, and I'll call it a func. And now I can use the function keyword as here, and I can omit the name because the name of the variable will be used in this case, and just use the parentheses followed by a block. And of course, here I can define my code. Also, JavaScript supports a more concise way to write functions that do not need a name, and therefore that we can assign to a variable by using the parentheses followed by an arrow and then a block of code. And this is a valid function. Indeed, here I can, of course, define some code, and I can assign this to another variable, which in this case I will call an arrow func, and assign it by the equal operator. Now, if we run this code without ever calling any of these functions, we will see that actually nothing happens, and that's because we need to call the function as said before in order for them to be evaluated. Now, if we only write the name of the function without the parentheses, we will get again nothing. So we need parentheses in order for JavaScript to recognize that we are requesting to evaluate this code inside here. If we now run code, see that console log inside here has been executed. Now, in order to show you that also this function and this function can be called, I just changed the value that gets printed out so that we can be sure that indeed that function is being called and running the program shows the three strings. Now, it's important to mention that the function declared with the function keyword can also be written later in the code, and the code will still be valid, but this is not true for functions that are inside a variable. In fact, this variable here is it since this is before, we until now don't know anything that is called a func. So running this code now gives us an error, and of course getting this back up here so we know that this is working, and calling this instead here, we now see that also this of course give us an error. For the same reason, an arrow func is not defined until that point when we call in fact an arrow func. So when declaring a function and assigning it to a variable, make sure that you don't call that function before. Instead, when doing that with a function keyword, this function now is available below and also above the declaration. So when talking about function, it's also important to introduce the scope. Now we can see what a scope is by declaring a block and declaring a variable inside that block. We see that this code will execute as normal. In fact, I can launch the scope.js, which is the file in which I am now, and see that the console log gets evaluated successfully. Now, if I try to print the scoped variable, which I declared inside the block, outside of this block, now running this code will give us an error. And the error is telling us that scoped var is not defined. And you can see that the error raised outer, in the outer console log, not in the inner. In fact, if we comment out this line of code, so this line of code is not being evaluated, and rerun the file, we'll see that the inner console log here, the inner, gets evaluated, and uh, the scoped bar, which shows the string I am the scoped bar, is printed out. So up until now, we only use one scope. Therefore, all our variables were available no matter where we call them. And this scope is the global scope, and it is called global because it is accessible globally. And by globally, I mean globally on the level of the project. Therefore, everything declared not inside the block is accessible everywhere in the code. And this is something that we usually want to avoid, because something that is accessible everywhere in the code, it can also be modified everywhere in the code. And this is usually not considered a good thing, because we can never be sure what the value of a variable is if it can be modified anytime from any point of the code. So from now on in the course, we will always define the variables inside some kind of block. So everything that is declared inside a block is only visible inside that block. And now, when I say that everything declared inside a block is visible inside a block, I mean that also if I declare an inner block, so I have a block here and another block here, then scoped bar will be visible all over here, but sub-scoped bar will not be visible here. And we can, of course, always test this by trying to see what the value of subscoped bar is here that is outside the block in which subscoped bar is being declared. And if we now run the code, we'll get an error again because subscoped bar is not defined. Instead, try to console log the subscoped bar inside the block in which subscoped bar is defined will give no error. In fact, the code gets evaluated as expected.